to join us today for Income Manager Client Briefing, and I'd like to go ahead and turn everything over to Michael Baldwin. So Michael, it is all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Tara. That was informative. Welcome, everyone. I know we have a good turnout today, and I'm excited to delve into our topic. This is the first of a series of webcast how-to seminars that we plan on conducting for our Income Manager clients. And today, of course, you've all registered for our topic of discussion, which is the query wizard in Income Manager. So we're going to be delving into that in quite a bit of detail. There's a lot of territory to cover off today, so I'm hoping we can get everything done in our allotted amount of time. So just before I get into that, just a couple of words, I guess, about ASI. As you all know, Income Manager as a company was acquired by Advanced Solutions International about 5 years ago. ASI is committed to maintaining and supporting and the continued development of Income Manager as an independent software system and platform. A little bit of information about ASI. The company was founded in 1991. It's privately owned, provides software and services to associations and nonprofits, 180 plus employees, and offices in the US and Canada, and the UK and Australia. We have 80 partners and 2,500 clients in 20 countries. Our leadership is provided by Robert Alves, the CEO, and Don Robertson is the heads up the development of the IMAS platform. Donna Benz, John Benda, Jocelyn Dyer. So that's kind of the key leadership team that you see there presented on the screen. So again, 2,500 associations, member organizations, regulatory bodies, unions, charities, nonprofits, public media, ministries, and faith-based organizations around the globe. And our platforms include the IMAS system. By the way, I do have interest from Income Manager clients sometimes looking to upgrade to the IMAS platform. It's completely different. If at any point in time you would like to discuss that possible upgrade opportunity with me, I'd be happy to go over that with you or give you a one-on-one demo for that. Another Canadian application was acquired, Cause to Give, a few years ago. Income Manager, of course. A company in the UK called Progress, a company in Australia called Dawnman, and a company in the US called Spacemaster. So with that, I am going to start with my presentation on the query wizard. What are queries? So today we're going to be talking about what are queries, and they are in fact questions that you ask to your database. There are an infinite number of questions you can ask, and that's why there's no single query that can answer every possible question. So everybody comes up with different questions they need to ask, and we have an infinite variety of queries and combinations of queries to handle that. The other thing to know is that queries are dynamic. They're always returned the most current recent information. It's not like a spreadsheet. If you open it one day, it looks the same the next day. If you run a query today and then run the same query tomorrow, you get different answers if there are some changes in the underlying data. So reasons to create queries: we use queries to build recipient or distribution lists for a marketing campaign, either by mail or email. We use queries to build special reports that may go beyond the built-in system reports in Income Manager. We use queries to analyze data for business intelligence or to support executive decision making. And we use queries to check and verify data. Surprisingly, I find that a lot of organizations or clients don't necessarily do that. Queries are a good way of doing a quick visual check for data integrity, if everything kind of looks okay. Oftentimes, when you can just run a query and give it a once-over glance, you can spot things that just don't look right. And so you can certainly use queries to verify the validity of data. About queries. Queries are always the most challenging function of using any database management system. We know that from our own experiences. Query Wizard is an Income Manager is a tool designed to help you create queries easily, relatively, and avoid having to use SQL structured query language to do so that looks something like this, if any of you have ever written SQL. And this is a very simple SQL statement, by the way. When you finally create a successful query, you sometimes feel like this. You've just pulled a rabbit out of a hat, and so time to celebrate. Congratulations. So today we're going to create these queries: a simple constituent and transaction query, an aggregate query returning the lifetime value of donors, a lapsed donor query, and a purge query. And then we're going to use that purge query in a message, a communication. All right. So on that note, let's get started. I've got Income Manager open. The assumption here is, of course, that you're all familiar with where to go to get to the query wizard in this version of Income Manager. I know we have some participants on board on our session today. They're perhaps using our older version, version 5, so it doesn't look like this. The query wizard tool in this version, by the way, is much more powerful and unique than the one we've used that you may have found in the previous version 5 of Income Manager. So the first place we want to start is, of course, you have here a panel with a list of the queries that you've created in the past, listed alphabetically. So, you know, just as a naming convention, sometimes it helps to group your queries with some kind of naming convention. It could be some kind of a prefix or number system that you might use to kind of organize queries if you have them in different sorts of classifications. So at this point, we're going to create a new query, and the query category, we provide you with a category. So I'm just going to call this financial, and I'm just going to call this 01 donors and donation history. This is a simple query, and we're going to use the constituents table and transactions. Other properties on this form, you'll notice some check boxes. Active, meaning that the query is being used. It's an active query as opposed to deactivating it. More importantly is allow other users to view your query or make changes to your query. Okay. A couple of other things while we check boxes while we're still on this panel. At the top left corner, you'll notice create aggregate query. So later the next query will be an aggregate query where we're going to sum up some information, tally things up, and then that we'll need to check that off. And then custom SQL queries. And we'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end. So I'm going to say next. So here's the step 2 of creating the query is where a lot of people just kind of like don't know where to go. So on the left-hand side, there are a number of tables. They're not really tables, so they're actually what we call views, but I just, for expediency, just call them tables. And they contain fields from various areas of the database. People sometimes get a bit overwhelmed by looking at the selection here. I think for most cases, or most often the case, you're going to need the constituent table. So that's one table that you're going to use on a regular basis. And if you're doing any kind of financial, querying any kind of financial information, you're going to need the transaction table, and you're going to need the transallocate table. So what do those things mean? The constituent table is really the data, the demographic profile when you look at a constituent. You know, the name and their profile and basic biological information. The transaction table is the major content of donation when you're processing the donation, and the allocation table really pertains to the different funds and accounts to which monies are being distributed. It's really the center of the donation processing form. In the middle part, you'll see program, fund, account, those, and the allocation amounts, which is why we call it allocation. So the next part of this is we have 3 tables, and we need to join these in some way. So we need to connect them. So we have the plus sign, of course, and we're gonna the other part people kind of stumble on is they don't understand the left and the right join. So what we're saying here is that the income managers is constituent centric. Everything happens around the constituent transactions and all the other sorts of bits and pieces of information that are being stored. So that's like the main table, and then the related table, of course, is the transaction table. And we have a join here, joins constituents to transactions. There is another join called attention to transactions. That's used for billing purposes. Then there are three selection buttons here. The default is equal join on both. So what does that mean? That means that we are only retrieving constituents who have transactions. If we have constituents which do not have transactions, they will not be returned in the query results. There are other options: select all rows from constituents and select all rows from transactions. The time that you might use something like select all rows from constituents, if you were looking for constituents who don't have any donation history. So you're looking for something that doesn't exist, in other words. And that would be an example, probably a prime example, of when you might use a different kind of join. Return all constituents, whether or not they do have transaction history in the transaction table. All right, so we've made that join, and now we also need to join the transaction table, which is think of the left join as the parent table, and then the right table is the child table. So it's a parent-child relationship, one-to-many. And we'll join that as well. So we have those two joins, okay? So just if you think of it in terms of parent-child, the left is the parent, the right is the child. Now we come to the selection of fields, and the table name is being displayed. So this is pretty obvious. You select the fields that you need. I recommend, or we recommend, you always include the constituent ID in your query, particularly if you plan on using this for some kind of marketing communication purposes, because many of your returns, etc., will be tracked based on your constituent ID. You have the option of selecting all the fields you may want. I'm just going to select first name and last name. Oops, this went a little too far. Last name, and I want the organization name. And now I'm going to go down and select the information that I want from the transaction table. So I want the trans amount and the trans date, and we might also want some receipt information from this. We'll put it in anyway. So we want the gift letter and the gift receipt and the gift amount, and the gift date, and if it was issued, and the number. Okay. And of course, you're free to select whatever fields you want. Now you can see if I scroll down a little bit further, we can see the allocation table. So this is where we're going to store the distribution of the total transaction, including the account that it went into, which revenue or GL account, the fund that it went into, the credit into the GL account, and that's probably enough from that, I think. Okay. All right, so we've determined these are the fields that we want to select. So, by the way, while you're here, if you need to sort your data, you can do so here. This becomes valuable if you expect a large data set result. In other words, thousands of records. You can sort your data on the results data sheet, but if there's a lot of records there, it can really tie up resources. So if you plan on doing that, sorting the data, then do it from here. So maybe we'll just do it on constituent. Okay. All right. So, and then the fourth and final step in the process, after we've determined what fields we want, is to indicate the criteria that we want to apply. So I think in this example, I'm just going to scroll down to the transaction. I'm looking for transactions within a date range. So between, here's a list of operators, by the way. I think their meaning is fairly self-evident. Sometimes maybe it's not. So we're going to use the operator date between and I'm going to go with the first, and I'm just going to backdate that to, I don't know, 14 or something, 2 or 3 years worth of data to today's date range. So once we put in the criteria there, we add the little checkbox to the right, the conditional clause that it's adding, and we may want to say where also the transaction amount is greater than or equal to, we just put in 10, just to add another condition. And then the other thing we might want to say is, well, you know what, let's run it, and then I'm going to come back and add something else as well. So we're going to run this. And there's our results from our query with the information that we want. While we're here, a couple of things on the data sheet that you might want to know about. At the very bottom, there is what they call max records. So it defaults to 1,001 records. You might say, well, I know I've got way over 1,000 records, or I'm sorry, 10,001. I've got well over 10,000 records here. You can change this, make it 20,000, 50,000, whatever. But just to give you kind of a heads up that if you're getting returns where you think that, no, there should be more records, it's the little arrow with the bar in front of it down at the bottom of the data sheet that allows you to change the maximum number of records returned. Okay. While we're here, we can also talk about summing some information. There's on the toolbar at the very top, there's a number of icons on there. One is a summation, or it's called totals. If you add totals, you'll get an additional line at the bottom to which you can add the total sum of credits, if you want to do that, or it could be on the receipt amounts. You want the sum of the receipts, or count of records, or whatever it may happen, whatever it happens to be. Okay, so it's just another little tip. And then oftentimes you may want to export the information. You have a number of options. Usually Excel is the best format you're going to use. So you click the Excel export format, brings up the dialog panel here, what you want to call it, browse to where you want to save it, what you want to call it, and then determine whether you want to open that, have that Excel open the file for you once it's been exported. You may want to use this feature not just to export it, but if you want to use the pivot table function in Excel to pivot information for reporting or analytical purposes as well. Okay, so I'm going to close that. No, before I do that, sorry, I'm just going to bring this over, and I noticed that in my results, I have different accounts that have been used, and so I want to avoid maybe gifts in kind if I was looking for, so I'm just going to change the criteria and add in as well on the account where account not in gift in kind, goods, food, and gift shop sales. So I want to exclude those figures or those accounts, and then I can run the query again that will eliminate those or not include accounts that I've indicated. By the way, the in and in not operator are very handy because they typically will give you a list of values that are stored in the database that you can select from. You can multi-select and add them as well. While I'm here, there's a couple of other comments. There, you'll notice some parentheses here. When do you use parentheses? If you're using the or, the and or operator in combination, or takes precedence over and. So you may have a clause that includes one or more and. So as I have here, for example, transaction date between this date and another date and an amount greater than or equal to. And then I might say, or some other combination, well, a different combination of dates and amounts or whatever the case may be. If we have time, maybe we'll do an example of that in a moment. Okay, so let's finish with that. The next query I was going to do was a aggregate query. So I'm going to create a new query. And in this case, I need to check off the aggregate query. And again, this is just going to be financial. And I'm just going to call this O2 LTV query. Okay, so in this case, I don't know if you noticed when we were looking at the fields in the tables, sometimes those fields are included, like the constituent ID is also included in the transaction table. That's how we were joined. So I may not actually need all of the information from the constituent table, and we'll see how that works. I don't necessarily have to do a join in this case. So I'm just going to use the one table, the transaction table. And here are the fields. There's the constituent ID that I'm interested in. And the structure of this is somewhat different than a regular query. So when we talk about aggregate queries in SQL terminology, they're typically called group by. But what we typically want to do is sum up some information. So we're going to group this on the constituent ID and the constituent name. And then more importantly, what I want to do is get the transaction amount, and I want to sum up the transaction amount. So I'm going to select transaction amount, and there you'll notice there's an alias, and I'm going to say sum. So now the alias is the sum of transaction, and I'm going to add that. Okay. And I'm going to add that's, I think, pretty much all I really need to get their lifetime value. If we wanted to return records where the sum of transaction amount is greater than a certain amount, we could highlight the sum of transaction amount, then select an operator greater than, for example, and again, we'll just say 10. So I only want donors whose lifetime value cumulatively is greater than 10. Oops, sorry. I had to select that again. There. What did I do? Greater than. Yeah, okay. Just a question of highlighting the right things. So again, where the sum of transactions is greater than 10. So that then will only return records where we have greater than 10. Oh, the other thing I want to do is I want to know the number of transactions that have occurred. So I'm going to use the transaction number and just count the number of transactions and add that to my list as well. And then I may also want to get an average of the transactions during that time. So I also want to see some averages. And I could also put in, well, we'll just leave it at that. I think that's good. Okay, again, we have the option to sort here. I have a very small sample database here, not a lot of records, so I don't really need to worry too much about sorting. If we're looking now for the lifetime value, that's a cumulative lifetime value of the donors. I don't necessarily need to put in a date range, but for example, if I did want, okay, total donations in the last 5 years, for example, then I could put in a date range. Let's run it first without the date range, and then we'll run it again with the date range and see what the difference looks like. So we're going to run it. So this is the results that we get. The top row is showing a no constituent, and the only reason that is because I have some journal entries in my database where there's a constituent or donor is not actually connected to those transactions. They're journal entries. I could eliminate that out of the equation. But there's the result. So we get one row per donor with the lifetime value of the donor, the number of donations, and their average gift. This is from the beginning of time. We could now say, well, using our example that I referred to, where the transactions, we want the cumulative transactions within a date range. So again, we'll just use today's date, and we'll go back to whatever, 2012. It's 5 years from now, and then add that criteria in it as well. And then we'll run the same query. So the results are somewhat different because we've excluded some previous donations. So this is an example of how you might want to return and retrieve and use this kind of information. If I needed other demographic information other than the constituent ID and the constituent name, I would have had to have included the constituent table again and joined that, of course, with the transaction table. But otherwise, the query is the same. Okay, so we'll just finish off that one. And now we're going to do a lapsed donor query. So I'm going to create a new query. And well, again, it's going to be financial. And I'm going to call this 03 lapsed donors. I encourage you to use the description field if the name of your query is a little ambiguous, or if you're doing something fairly complex in your queries, then maybe kind of describe for others that might want to use it, refer to it later as to what it is you're doing. So it's not a bad idea. And in this case now, I'm going to select the constituent table. There's a couple of things going on here. One is called first and last donations. And then there's another one called last donations. And so I'm going to talk about what the differences are from that. By the way, if you're ever not curious about what's in a particular view or table and you're not sure, you've never used it before, you can just select that table. In fact, let's do that. Let's take this out. Let's put in, as an example, last donations, and next. And I'm just going to include all the fields, because I'm going to say, I've never seen this before. I don't know what this is. So I'm going to select everything, and then just go next, and then just run it, and take a look and see what's there. So this is this table or view is returning to me. The campaign, the constituent name, the solicitation, the trans amount, the date, transaction number, the trans pledge. So this would be useful, this particular view or table, if you were looking for something like, well, not only am I looking for the last donation, I'm actually looking for the second last donation, because you'll notice there's a ranking for the transactions. So there's Bank of Montreal, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4 transactions for the Bank of Montreal. Same thing with Mary Goodwill. Oops. Okay, or I'm sorry, Henry Goodwill. 1, 2, 3, 4. So if you're looking for the ranking of a transaction, I want to find the second last donation or the third last or whatever the case may be. So that's where you might use this table if you're getting into that kind of a query structure. I'm going to save it. I'm just going to go back though. So I just wanted to show you how that works, that if you were curious about something, you don't know what's there, just create a new query, use that table, pull over all the fields, and okay. All right, so back to where we were originally, starting with the constituents table, and now we have this other view or table called first and last donations. And that's really what this returns. That view returns the constituents' first and last contributions or donations. Okay. Here's our join. Again, we'll take the constituent ID and first name, last name, organization name. Scroll down, and here's the fields available from the that table. Again, the constituent ID constituent is replicated in there, so maybe you don't really need the constituent table. It's up to you. Let's kind of choose everything. No, we're going to select the first date and first amount, first date, last amount, last date, the number of gifts, and the total gift amount. And then run that over. And then we want to say where the condition is. What is the definition of a lapsed donor? Typically hasn't donated in the last 12 months, but it could be some other definition. That's basically entirely up to you. But it's the last date or their last gift that determines what is a lapsed donor. And of course, you could have different categories of lapsed: recently lapsed, longer term lapsed, and lapsed many, many years ago. That sort of thing. So we're going to say where the last gift date is less than a year ago. And just change the 17 to a 16. So in other words, their last gift occurred before a year ago today. Okay. And again, we'll run that. And so there's the results. There's their first gift amount and the first gift date, and the last gift amount and the last gift date. And these were all before then. Okay. Again, you can output this to an Excel file if you needed to do that, or use it in some other way. Okay, so we'll finish up on that. And now we're going to continue with creating a purge query. So I'm going to create a new query. And this will be constituents. I'm going to call this 05 purge query. And purge query, the reason I'm calling this a purge query is because I'm going to use it for in my communications, my mass communications, direct mail appeals, etc. Oftentimes people, the ED may come to you and say, well, we need this special list of people, and it includes reams and reams of criteria. And our recommendation is always to try to break it down into smaller, more manageable bits and pieces. And this is one way of doing that. Instead of saying, give me a list of people who's lapsed donors, but then they're do not solicit and do not mail, and they're deceased, or that becomes fairly complex in terms of adding conditions and criteria. So we want to try to simplify that process a bit. And this really helps in being able to do that. You don't always then have to be by creating this purge query as a one-time thing, you don't have to be worried about doing that all the time, every time you're creating a query, looking to eliminate or exclude people that don't qualify. So let's see what that looks like. Many of you may have already been doing this anyway. So, but we'll see how effective it can be. So active, it means whether the constituent is active in your database or not. If someone is deceased, they are automatically flagged as inactive anyway. So, so again, we'll use the first name. Oops. Last name. Organization name. I want the move flag, the no solicitations flag, active. So we've got active, deceased. You know what? I think I'll move these up to all to the top. And no solicitations, move those up, top and deceased, like that. And I think that's what I'm going to need and use for this query. We can always come back and modify it if I've forgotten something or omitted something. So we'll go next. And now we need to put in our criteria. Here's where we're going to use the OR operator. So we're going to say we're active. So by default, all our active constituents, the active flag is true. But we don't want people that are active. We want people that are not active. So where active is false. Okay, we'll add that. And then we want our deceased flag where deceased may be true. I'm sorry, this should be an or deceased is true. If I say and, if I use both and, then the query results would have to meet both conditions at the same time. I'm saying it's one or the other, not both at the same time. And then I've got moved, or moved is true, or no solicitations is true. Okay, so there's our conditions, where active is false, or deceased is true, or moved is equal to true, or no solicitations is equal to true. So for the results to qualify, they must have one of those. They must qualify with at least one of those conditions. They can qualify with more than one, but they must qualify by having at least one of those conditions in the results. So we'll just run it, see what we get. Again, this is a small sample database, so it's not like going to be a huge volume of records here. But we can see here that there's some true flags here and a true flag there, more true flags, another true flag here. So these people are ones that are the people that we would not want to include in our communications. So let's see how that works. I understand that many of you are already perhaps using this. In our communications module, if we go to messages and oh, there we go. There we go. Okay, let's find a message that we could try this out on. I've got something here called the 2017 Winter Direct Mail. By the way, in our next session, I think in sometime in December, we haven't kind of finalized the date yet, or in fact, what exactly the topics might be, but I think we're going to plan on doing another session, and I'm thinking it will be, we will do something on communications and marketing. Essentially, this module, the communications module, and in particular the marketing and using this tool to build recipient list. I'm going to not get into that right now, but we just want to see what we have. We've already built a list here of recipients through various mechanisms. And now, typically what you want to do is clean up your direct mail list after you've built it. You don't want to start doing this halfway through the list build. You want to then, once everything is done, be able to remove anybody that's on your purge query. So we're going to go to queries, and there's our purge query. And so what I'm saying now is remove any of the deceased, inactive, moved, or do not solicit constituents from the distribution list. And 6 were removed because they met those criteria. Okay. So, okay, I think that kind of wraps up our presentation today for using the query wizard. As I said, there's an infinite number of queries that you can create. I haven't created necessarily the most complex queries, but I've hopefully shown you the structure and the approach to using the query wizard in hopefully a more effective way. So I also have Jim on the line, Jim Perrin, who handles our support. And I'm just going to pass it over to Jim for a moment here. He's just going to comment on Income Manager clients and the supporting protocols now that are in place. There was a time, of course, you could just pick up the phone and call us. You know, those days don't exist anymore. Now you need to go through a certain client customer protocol. So on that, Jim, why don't I pass it on to you and you can comment on that. And then I guess we can go into the questions section. Tara, Jim, over to you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, as far as support goes, the protocol is to use what they call the Zendesk, and really what you have to do is sign into this process. And I've got a write-up on how to do it, and if you would like me to send it to you, please get in touch with me, and I will do that. Yeah, I think most of you got my email address anyway, and or let Michael know, and I'll send it along to you. And basically, you just sign into it, you know, and give yourself a username and password, and from there, any requests for support that you require, you go through the Zendesk, and it's tracked from there, so that it doesn't get lost in the system anywhere. So that's about the long and short of it. It's a fairly straightforward process, and we can see just where we're at with solving your issue, and once it's completed, it's completed.
So that's Jim, on from Income Manager clients and that are submitting support requests, those support requests then pretty much automatically go to you, or it just kind of depends on the nature of the support request?
It depends on the nature. Some of them go to Teresa, some of them go to myself.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Jim.
Okay.
So yeah, I guess getting well, Jim, how do they get in contact with you to request? I guess
they can email me at jperrin@advsol.com.
Okay. Thanks, Jim. Tara, I guess back to you for questions.
Absolutely. And as I stated before, we are going to go through the questions in my queue in the order in which they've come in. And starting with the first question, it's, would it be okay to join constituent to trans-allocate, or must you always join transaction to trans-allocate?
That's a good question. I've never actually tried it. Why don't we give it a shot, see what happens? I'm not sure what the benefit might be. We just call this 06 test. Oops. By the way, I would encourage you, you'll notice I put a parentheses in accidentally in there, and I would encourage you in the name of your query to not use any uppercase characters. I'm sorry, not uppercase. Any exclamation marks, any of the upper registry keys above the number keyboard line. So question marks, dollar signs, percent signs, those tend to be reserved SQL symbols. So don't use anything like that. Just use underscores, maybe a hyphen. But the reason being is that they could mess up your query if you do get into using those characters. So let's see what happens. If I don't think there's a direct join, to be honest, between constituents and transallocate, because it is a parent-child relationship. Well, let's see. No, there's. Oh yeah. Okay, there is. Yeah, you can. So there you go. I didn't even know that. I've never used it. I always tended to use all three tables, simply because maybe I wanted the date, which is more typical because that's stored in the transaction table. I don't know if that's replicated in the transallocate table or not. Oh, yes, it is. Okay, so yes, the answer is yes, you can.
Okay, my next question is, I want to make sure we are understanding this correctly. For clarification, we will be using a purge query to remove unwanted constituents from our original query. So for example, if I'm running a mail campaign and want to remove all the do not solicit constituents, I would use the purge query after pulling all the contacts I want to mail.
Correct. Now there is a process here though, in the communications module. When you create your communication, the mailing that you're going to use, again, we'll go back to 2017, and you've created the recipient list, you can use, of course, queries to create that recipient list. So I might want to add all the people in 01 donors and donation history, and I can add those in, and they were added. Now I've continued to build my distribution list, fund holders or donors or whatever it is that I build the actual distribution list. So it doesn't remove the people from the original query. In other words, if I use this query to add to the distribution list, it doesn't remove the people from the query. It removes the people from the recipient list, which is separate from the query. The recipient list is a separate table that stores the communications and solicitation history. And so now I can purge out the people that I don't want to at this stage. Does that answer the question?
Okay, so moving on to the next question in my queue, and then you did get a response saying, yes, thanks, it does answer the question. So moving on to the next question, it's, hi, Michael, thank you for this presentation. And will there be another session to help with more complex compounded queries, or do you provide support for custom SQL scripts? Also, is it possible to upload a list of individuals back onto IM to tag them with a specific message?
I'm not quite clear about the second part of that question, but let me deal with the first part first.
Yeah.
So yes, thank you for bringing that up. There is a facility, in fact, when we do a query to, well, it's called a custom SQL. So sometimes there's a necessity for us, the development team, and typically Ali, to create a custom SQL statement that looks something like this, which is kind of in the beginning of the presentation. I showed you what an SQL statement looked like. And the reason for that is that one thing that the query wizard does not do is that you cannot nest a query. In other words, you cannot create a query and then create a new query based on that query. See, in SQL and in Access, you can create what they call nested queries. The query wizard doesn't provide that level of flexibility, even though it is powerful. So in this case, Ali has created a special SQL statement for this particular client. So oftentimes our community foundation clients have come to us and asked us for something like this because it's just not possible or able to accomplish through the query wizard. So if I run this, this gives me the fund and the, oh, okay. So in this particular case, this was the sum and the credits and debits, but in a typical query in Income Manager, it doesn't subtract one from the other. So you can't subtract sum of credits from sum of debits, or the other way around, sorry, to give us a fund balance. So Ali wrote this query that would do that and then provide the current balance of those funds at this point in time. So that's a good example. You could do this in Excel as well. You could have like just done your query and get all the debits and credits for that fund, export to Excel, and then just create a new column in Excel to calculate the deduction of one from the other. But this just saves time. And I'm sorry, what was the other part of the question?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm going to read you the original, and then I'm going to read you the subsequent question that goes along with it. And it is it possible to upload a list of individuals back onto IM to tag them with specific messages? And she stated, for the second part of that, because you had questioned it before, if I massage a list in Excel, could I reload this list, if you will, back into IM without transactions?
If she's talking about importing constituents into Income Manager from an external file, whatever the source of that file is, an Excel file or CSV file, and the answer is yes. So there is an import tool that comes with Income Manager called Import Manager. We have instructions on how to use it, and you can import, your constituent information, name, address, and all that kind of information, even though there may not be any transaction history, and flag that or add those people to some kind of special group or some kind of special list, if you like, or special constituent type. So in other words, in some way identify them that they've been imported for a particular purpose, and then retrieve that information for whatever that purpose might be that you need to carry out, maybe for a mailing or something like that, But so the answer is yes.
Okay, so my next question is, how do you ensure that a donor is not mailed twice for the same mailing but different segments? Can we purge one segment from another?
Well, there shouldn't be any. There shouldn't be a requirement to do that anyway, because if we go back to our list, where's our 2017 here? So the recipient list, Income Manager dedupes the recipient list as you build it anyway. So in other words, if you add people that are donors and then use some query that includes those people, and they're added in several times because they're on lists or constituent types or queries, you don't need to worry about that. Income Manager dedupes that list at the same time. If when you're adding people, you can add them to a particular segment, but then they wouldn't get added again to another segment. They could only be in one segment at a time. That would be more typically used with queries where you're saying, I want a list of high value donors for this particular mailing that have given in a particular range, and I'm going to add them to segment A, and the next category would be segment B, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not quite sure how you would have a duplicate in two different segments in the same communication, because Income Manager wouldn't allow for that anyway.
Okay, and that is the last question that I have in queue for you.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you everyone for attending today's session. I hope it was helpful, useful for you. Again, it was just meant to give you a quick overview of what the Query Wizard can do. It's always the most challenging part of a database management system anyway. We all understand that, and of course that's why there's support, and Jim is there to help out if you have some more complex queries that you need to get into, and sometimes you need to think these things through. But thank you everyone for joining us today.